have never been much of a camper. I've always liked the idea of it. Sitting around a fire, cooking food over the flames, waking up to fresh air. But the reality has never lived up to my expectations. The uneven ground, the unpredictable weather, the way every small noise in the woods sounds like something creeping closer. But that didn't stop me from agreeing when my old friend, Matt, invited me on a weekend trip to a remote campsite in the middle of nowhere. We planned it for months. Matt had found a place deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was one of those spots that wasn't an official campground but was known among serious campers as a great place to get away from everything. No cell service, no running water, just trees and a lake. He promised it would be exactly what we needed to disconnect from the world for a while. We left early on a Friday morning, the car packed with everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, food, a couple of coolers full of beer, and a few knives in case we needed them for cutting rope or firewood. The drive was long, and as we got further from civilization, the roads became rougher, turning from asphalt to dirt. By the time we reached the spot, there was nothing but forest in every direction. We parked the car at the end of the trail, then carried our gear down a narrow path to the clearing where we'd set up camp. It was a perfect spot, flat ground, plenty of trees for shade, and the lake just a short walk away. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. Setting up camp took a while, but we got everything arranged just the way we wanted it. 2 tents side by side, a fire pit in the middle, and a makeshift cooking area near a fallen log that we used as a bench. Once everything was in place, we cracked open a couple of beers and settled in, enjoying the quiet. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked some food, and talked about work, life, and the usual things old friends talk about when they finally get a chance to catch up. It wasn't until later that night, when I was lying in my tent, that I started to feel uneasy. There was no real reason for it, just a nagging feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet, the darkness too deep. I told myself I was just overthinking things and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, we decided to hike around the area, exploring the trails near our campsite. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, making it feel much later in the day than it actually was. The deeper we went, the more I felt that same unease from the night before. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something wasn't right. After a few hours, we stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop: a campsite. But not just any campsite. It looked abandoned, like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. A tent was still standing, but the entrance was open, and inside, I could see a sleeping bag partially unzipped, as if someone had left in the middle of the night. Nearby, there was a fire pit filled with ashes, but the logs had been scattered, as if someone had kicked them apart. A backpack sat against a tree, untouched, its straps covered in dirt and leaves. Matt and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe they just left in a hurry," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. We walked around the site, looking for any clues about what had happened. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing that screamed danger. Just an abandoned camp that had been left to decay. The strangest part was the food. There were a few cans of food near the fire pit, unopened, and a half-eaten granola bar resting on a rock. It didn't make sense. If someone had decided to leave, why not take their food with them? Why leave everything behind? Something about it made me want to leave right then and there, but Matt insisted we keep going, saying we were probably overthinking things. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. That night, as we sat around the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about that abandoned campsite. Who had been there? Why had they left? Had something scared them off? The questions swirled in my head, and I found myself listening to the forest, waiting for something, anything, to confirm the fear that had been growing inside me. Then, just as we were about to call it a night, we heard it. A branch snapping in the distance. Both of us froze, staring out into the darkness. Another snap, closer this time. Then silence. "Probably just an animal," Matt said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there watching us. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something moving outside the tent. Quiet, deliberate footsteps, stopping and starting as if whoever was out there was trying not to be heard. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, holding it close, just in case. The hours dragged on. At some point, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already up, and Matt was sitting by the fire, looking pale. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight. I didn't argue. We packed up in record time, stuffing everything into our bags without bothering to organize it. As we loaded the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, not ours, not animal prints, human prints. They circled our tents, wandered near the fire pit, and then disappeared into the woods. Neither of us said a word as we got into the car and drove away. We didn't stop until we were back on paved roads, civilization within reach. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us, but I know one thing for sure: I will never go camping again. I was looking forward to the trip. A weekend alone in the woods, away from everything. Work, responsibilities, the noise of life. It had been a long time since I'd done anything for myself, and I needed this. Just me, my tent, and nature. No distractions. No phone. No people. Just quiet. I picked a remote spot deep in the national forest, about a 4-hour drive from home. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing I'd found online, buried miles from the nearest paved road. I wanted solitude, and I was going to get it. The drive-in was uneventful. The highway stretched for miles, then turned into winding back roads. Eventually, those back roads turned into dirt paths, where the only other vehicles I saw were old, rusted-out trucks left abandoned in the brush. The farther I went, the less I saw of anything man-made. I followed the directions I had written down, turning left at a split in the trail marked by a fallen tree. Another 2 miles and I saw the clearing. It was perfect. Tall trees surrounded it, giving me privacy, but there was enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. A narrow stream ran just beyond the tree line, and the air smelled fresh and clean. I parked the truck and set up camp quickly, unfolding my tent and unrolling my sleeping bag inside. I gathered wood for a fire, then sat down to enjoy the silence. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the distant sounds of animals moving through the woods, and stared up at the sky. The stars were brighter out here than I had ever seen before. It was perfect, but then things changed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than expected. Something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the air was different. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off and went about my day. I hiked a bit, collected more firewood, and enjoyed the scenery. But the feeling stayed. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But I was alone. I knew I was alone. Then I noticed something strange. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, my gear had moved. Not much, just a little. My sleeping bag was shifted slightly to the side, and my water bottle was tipped over. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or that maybe I had done it without thinking. But it bothered me. I knew where I had put everything. By evening, the unease had settled deep in my bones. The forest felt too quiet. Even as the sun set, I didn't hear the usual sounds of birds or insects. It was like everything had gone still. I built a fire and tried to push the feeling away. I ate dinner, listened to the crackling flames, and reminded myself that I was safe. But then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the rustling of leaves in the wind. These were slow, deliberate steps. Human. My stomach dropped. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. But the footsteps stopped as soon as I noticed them. I held my breath, listening. The fire crackled. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had heard a branch falling. Maybe I was just jumpy. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. That night, I woke up to something outside my tent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just inches from the thin fabric of my tent. I froze, my whole body locked up, my mind racing. I listened, every nerve in my body on fire. It was right there. Whoever or whatever, it was standing right outside my tent, just listening. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. My heart was hammering. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the knife, my back pressed against the tent wall. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. When the first light of morning crept through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing was empty. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, shoving everything into my truck without caring if it was neat. I just wanted to get out of there. As I turned the truck around, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. Deep in the woods, just beyond the tree line, there was a shape, person, standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't wait. I floored the gas, speeding down the dirt path, barely missing trees as I drove faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing: I will never camp alone again. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful. That's why I agreed when my brother, Mark, asked if I wanted to go on a weekend camping trip with him. It had been years since we'd done anything like that together, and I figured it would be nice to get away from work, from responsibilities, from life in general. Just two brothers and the wilderness. We chose a spot deep in the Hoosier National Forest. It was a place we had camped at once when we were younger, but we hadn't been back in years. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing off one of the lesser-known trails. We packed light, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bags, enough food for a couple of days, a hatchet, a couple of knives, and a small camping stove. Mark brought his rifle just in case. I laughed at him for it, but he shrugged and said he never went into the deep woods without one. The hike in was longer than I remembered. The trail was narrow, the underbrush thick. Branches scraped against my arms as we pushed through, and at one point we had to cross a small creek. The water was cold, and my boots got soaked, which pissed me off, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one complaining on our first day out. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. We worked fast, setting up the tent and gathering firewood. Mark handled the fire while I got our gear organized. By the time we had everything set up, the stars were coming out, and the forest had fallen into that eerie quiet that happens right after sunset. Dinner was simple, canned chili heated over the fire. We sat on a couple of logs and ate in silence, listening to the occasional rustle in the trees around us. The night was colder than I expected, and the fire felt good. We stayed up for a while, watching the flames and sipping whiskey from Mark's flask. We didn't talk much, just the occasional comment about work, about how different life was from when we were kids. At some point, Mark stood up and stretched. "I'm gonna take a leak," he muttered and walked off into the dark. I poked at the fire, watching the embers glow red hot. A few minutes passed, then a few more. I frowned, glancing in the direction Mark had gone. "Mark," I called. No answer. I sighed and stood up. "You fall in or something?" Still nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, revealing trunks and branches but nothing else. A weird feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I took a few steps in the direction he had gone, shining my light ahead of me. "Mark, quit screwing around." Silence. Then a sound, soft, distant. It was the crunch of leaves, but it didn't sound like footsteps. It was more uneven, like something dragging across the forest floor. My skin prickled. I took another step forward. The light of the fire behind me felt small, weak. I suddenly wished I had my knife on me. "Mark," I said again, quieter this time. Something moved in the trees, just at the edge of my light. I couldn't see what it was, just a shape shifting in the shadows. I took another step, my heart hammering now. My boot hit something and I looked down. A boot print, half covered by disturbed leaves. Mark's boot print. I followed it with my light, my pulse thudding in my ears. The tracks went deeper into the woods. I followed them slowly, cautiously. Then, just ahead, something lay on the ground. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was Mark's hat. I bent down, picking it up. It was damp with sweat, still warm. That meant he had been here recently. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight around. The woods seemed to press in around me, the darkness thick. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard it. A scream. Not an animal, not some distant call. A real human scream. And it was Mark. I ran. My legs felt slow, heavy, like I was moving through water. The trees blurred past me as I followed the sound. The scream came again, raw, terrified, and then silence. I stumbled into a small clearing, panting. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, landing on something on the ground. Mark. He was on his hands and knees, breathing hard. I rushed to him, grabbing his shoulder. "Mark, what happened?" He flinched at my touch and turned to look at me. His face was pale, eyes wide with something I had never seen in him before. Pure fear. "We need to go," he gasped. What the hell happened?" He shook his head. "We need to go. Now." I hesitated for only a second, then nodded. I hooked my arm under his and pulled him to his feet. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I half dragged, half carried him back toward our camp. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across our gear. I grabbed my pack and shoved things inside as fast as I could. Mark did the same, though his hands were unsteady. We left most of our stuff behind. The only thing that mattered was getting out. The hike back was brutal. Mark didn't say a word, and I didn't ask. I could still hear the echo of his scream in my head. We didn't stop, didn't rest, just kept moving, pushing through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. When we finally saw the road, I nearly collapsed with relief. We practically ran to the truck. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands still shaking. When the engine roared to life, he slammed it into drive, and we tore out of there, gravel flying behind us. Neither of us spoke the entire ride home. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken things. When we finally pulled into my driveway, he turned to me, his face still pale. "Don't ever ask me about what I saw," he said. I nodded. "We haven't been camping since." I should have never gone back to that campsite. The first time I went there, it was just a quick overnight trip. I was alone, something I'd done plenty of times before. I liked the quiet of solo camping, the way the forest swallowed sound, the way the air smelled clean and untouched, the way a crackling fire felt like my only companion. But that trip left a feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear exactly, more like unease, like something just slightly off. It was the small things, a squirrel that wouldn't stop staring at me, frozen like a statue for way too long. The way the wind would kick up and then suddenly die, like someone turning a switch on and off. A single boot print near my tent that wasn't mine. I told myself I was imagining things. I left early that morning and didn't come back for a year. Then my brother, Daniel, brought up the idea of a weekend camping trip. He'd just gone through a rough breakup and needed the distraction. I didn't want to go back there, but I didn't have a solid reason not to. So I agreed. The drive out was fine. We took his truck, packed with enough gear to last a week even though we'd only be gone for 2 nights. The campsite was deep in the woods, off a dirt road that barely looked like it got used. No cell service, just trees and quiet. Daniel was excited, talking about how nice it was to get away from everything. I tried to match his energy, but something about being back there made my stomach knot up. We set up camp quickly, tent, firewood, food. The place looked the same as before, too quiet. I kept checking the tree line without realizing it. Daniel noticed. "What's up?" he asked. "Nothing, just thought I heard something." He laughed, shook his head. "Relax, man. It's just the woods." I tried to believe him. I really did. That night, we sat by the fire, drinking beers and talking about stupid things. Work, old stories, people we used to know. The fire popped and cracked, and Daniel eventually crawled into the tent, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I should have gone to bed too. Instead, I just sat there, staring into the dark. It was the same feeling as before, that wrongness. I listened, trying to pick out anything that sounded off. The forest wasn't silent. There were the usual night sounds, insects, and the occasional rustling in the brush. But there was something else, something deeper. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a sound, exactly. More like an absence, like the trees were holding their breath. I turned in, eventually, laid in my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling of the tent, listening, waiting. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I know when I woke up, because someone was outside the tent. Not something, someone. I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps circling us. Slow, careful, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might wake Daniel. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps stopped right by my head. I could hear breathing, low and steady. I wanted to grab my knife, but I was too scared to move. My fingers twitched, but I stayed frozen. Then, just as slowly as they came, the footsteps moved away, fading back into the trees. I don't know how long I laid there, staring at nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, Daniel didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. He woke up complaining about his back hurting, stretching as he stepped outside the tent. I followed him out, pretending like I had slept at all. And then I saw them. Footprints, not ours. These were fresh, pressed into the dirt, circling the tent. One slow, deliberate loop, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to think of a way to explain them. Daniel saw my face and frowned. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the prints. He followed my gaze, then went quiet. We stood there for a long time. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us wanted to be the first to admit it. Eventually, Daniel cleared his throat. "Could be an animal," he muttered. "A bear, maybe." I didn't argue, but we both knew that wasn't true. We spent the rest of the day acting like nothing was wrong. I wanted to pack up and leave, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say it. So we stayed. We hiked, fished, tried to act normal. But the woods felt different now, tighter, like they were closing in. That night, I sat by the fire again, staring into the trees. I didn't hear anything, but I knew. I could feel it. We weren't alone. I wanted to tell Daniel we should leave, but before I could, he stood up suddenly. "Gotta take a piss," he muttered. He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the dark. And then I heard him scream. I was on my feet before I even realized it, running toward the sound. The flashlight was on the ground, the beam bouncing wildly off the trees. Daniel was there, backing away from something, or someone. There was a man standing just at the edge of the light. He was naked, filthy, skin stretched too tight over his bones. He didn't move, just stood there watching us. His eyes were too wide, his mouth slightly open, like he was just as shocked to see us as we were to see him. I grabbed Daniel's arm and yanked him back. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. We ran. We grabbed what we could and threw it into the truck. Left the tent, the cooler, the fire still burning. Neither of us looked back. The drive home was silent. Daniel's hands were shaking so bad I had to take the wheel. We never talked about it again. Never went back. I don't know who he was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I think about that night. I think about those footprints, about the way the trees felt wrong. And I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. I never really enjoyed camping alone, but that weekend, I didn't have a choice. My friends bailed last minute, and I had already requested the time off work. I figured it would be nice to get away from everything, even if I had to do it alone. The campsite was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from home. It wasn't a popular spot, which was perfect. No noisy campers, no families with kids running around. Just me, my tent, and the sounds of nature. The drive out was uneventful, long stretches of road cutting through thick forest, occasionally opening up to fields or abandoned buildings that had long since been forgotten. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the wind blowing through the trees. I parked my truck near the clearing, grabbed my gear, and got to work setting up my tent. I kept my cooler and supplies in the truck for now. No point in leaving food out in the open to attract animals. The tent went up quickly, and I started gathering firewood. The trees around me were dense, their branches twisted and tangled. Every so often, I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye. Just the wind, I told myself, but something about the air felt heavy, like the woods were watching me. I shook the feeling off, got a small fire going, and cooked some canned chili. The smell was comforting, filling the cold air with something familiar. As I ate, I tried to relax, listening to the crackling flames and the distant hoot of an owl. Night fell fast. The fire was the only source of light, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. I tried to enjoy the silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet. No insects buzzing, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. I decided to turn in early. I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the tent flap partially open so I could keep an eye on the fire. The warmth of the flames made me feel safe, but that feeling didn't last long. A noise pulled me from my light sleep, something moving outside my tent. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow footsteps crunching the dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. I clicked it on and shined it toward the entrance of the tent. Nothing, just my fire burning low. I waited, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag and slowly unzipped the tent. The firelight didn't reach far, but I could make out the shapes of trees and shadows stretching into the darkness. I stepped out, keeping low, my flashlight scanning the area. The air was cold, thick with tension. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure, tall, standing perfectly still between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person. I lifted my flashlight, shining it directly at them. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a hooded jacket, hands at their sides. "Hello," I finally called out, my voice shaking. No response. I gripped my knife tighter, every muscle in my body tensed. My mind raced through options. Should I run? Get in my truck? What if they had a weapon? Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back into the trees. Not hurried, not scared, just slow, deliberate steps, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my keys from the tent, threw my gear in the truck, and doused the fire with the remaining water from my bottle. My hands shook as I got in the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, heart hammering in my chest. My headlights cut through the trees, but the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until I found a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and sat there until the sun came up. I never went back to that campsite. I still don't know who or what I saw that night, but I know one thing: I wasn't alone out there. I don't know why I agreed to go camping that weekend. Maybe it was the promise of fresh air, Or maybe I just wanted to get away from work and the constant hum of the city. Either way, I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and met up with my brother, Jake. He had been planning this trip for weeks, and I didn't want to let him down. The spot he picked was deep in the woods, miles from any town, the kind of place where your phone stops working and the only sound you hear at night is the wind moving through the trees. The drive took longer than expected. The gravel road leading to the campsite was rough, full of potholes and scattered rocks that kicked up dust behind us. Trees lined both sides of the road, thick and dark even in the daylight. It felt like we were heading straight into the middle of nowhere, which I guess we were. When we finally pulled up to the clearing, I had to admit, it was beautiful. A small, still lake stretched out in front of us, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. The water was so clear I could see fish swimming just beneath the surface. Beyond the lake, the forest stretched endlessly, nothing but thick, towering trees in every direction. It was peaceful, isolated, the perfect place to camp. Jake and I set up our tents near the tree line. We gathered firewood, set up chairs, and cracked open a couple of beers as the sun dipped below the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was nice, quiet. I remember thinking that I should do this more often, get away from everything and just exist in the world for a while. That first night, nothing happened. We sat around the fire, cooked some food, talked about nothing in particular. The stars overhead were endless, brighter than I'd seen in years. Eventually, we crawled into our tents and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. The second day was when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The woods felt different, heavier. The air was still, like the trees were holding their breath. I noticed it early in the morning when I woke up to use the bathroom. Normally, the forest is full of noise, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But that morning it was silent, completely silent. I chalked it up to my imagination, shook it off and went about the day. We spent most of the afternoon fishing, caught a few decent-sized trout, and cooked them over the fire. But the strange feeling never really left. It sat in the back of my mind, making my skin crawl for no reason I could explain. Then, late that afternoon, I found something. I had wandered a little ways into the woods, looking for more firewood. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the light, making it feel later than it actually was. I was about 50 yards from camp when I saw it. A small clearing, the ground covered in dried leaves and broken branches. In the center of the clearing was something strange. A pile of bones. Not animal bones, at least not any that I could recognize. They were clean, picked bare, scattered in a way that didn't seem natural. Some of them looked cracked, splintered, like they had been broken apart. I stood there for a long time, staring at the pile. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. My stomach twisted, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to get out of there. I turned and walked quickly back to camp, trying to push the image out of my head. But I couldn't. The sight of those bones, the eerie silence of the forest, it stuck with me. That night, things got worse. We were sitting by the fire again, but the atmosphere had changed. Jake must have felt it too because he was quieter than usual. The forest around us seemed even darker, the trees pressing in closer. The silence was absolute. No wind, no movement, just the distant crackling of the fire. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. But then I listened closer. It wasn't just movement. It was something else. A low, steady breathing. Deep, measured. Like someone was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. I didn't say anything at first. I just listened. The breathing didn't move, didn't fade. It stayed in the same spot, slow and deliberate. My skin prickled, and I turned to Jake. He had noticed it too. He was sitting stiffly, staring into the dark woods, his hand resting near the hatchet he kept next to his chair. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, frozen, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, and then suddenly it stopped, just like that. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My body was telling me to run, to get in the truck and leave, but we didn't. Instead, we sat there, waiting, listening for anything else. But nothing happened. After a long while, we finally forced ourselves to go to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear something, anything, outside. But there was nothing, just silence. Morning came and we made a decision. We were leaving. Neither of us wanted to admit it outright, but we both knew something wasn't right. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, barely speaking. The feeling of being watched never went away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just that empty, endless forest. We got in the truck and drove, bouncing down the dirt road, the trees blurring past us. The further we got from that campsite, the better I felt. The tension in my chest eased, and I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We never went back. I never even looked up that area again. I don't want to know what was out there, don't want to think about what could have been watching us. All I know is that something that wasn't supposed to be there, and I hope to God I never find out what it was. I never thought much about camping alone. I had done it plenty of times before, sometimes for a weekend escape, sometimes just to clear my head. It wasn't something that scared me. If anything, it was one of the few things in life that made me feel truly at peace. Being out there, away from the noise of everything, just listening to the wind moving through the trees, the crackling of a fire, and the distant sounds of nature. It was something I always looked forward to. So when I had a long weekend off work, I didn't hesitate. I packed my truck with my gear and drove out to a place I had been meaning to visit for a while, a secluded area deep in the forest, about an hour from the nearest town. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a spot I had read about on a hiking forum. A few people had mentioned it was quiet, undisturbed, and perfect for someone who wanted real solitude. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive out was uneventful. The roads were mostly empty, and by the time I turned onto the dirt path leading into the woods, I had seen only a handful of cars the entire trip. The deeper I went, the narrower the path became. Trees closed in on either side, their branches stretching over the road, filtering the late afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns on my windshield. After another 15 minutes, I reached the spot. It was perfect, a clearing just big enough to park my truck, with plenty of space to set up my tent. The land sloped gently down toward a small creek that ran through the trees, the sound of running water adding to the already peaceful atmosphere. There were no signs of other campers, no fire pits, no trampled grass, no leftover trash, just untouched wilderness. I set up my tent quickly, getting everything organized before the sun dipped too low. After gathering some wood for a fire, I sat back in my folding chair, enjoying the evening air. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the steady trickle of the creek. It was exactly what I had hoped for. As darkness settled, I cooked a simple meal over the fire and leaned back, staring up at the stars. The temperature dropped a bit, but nothing too bad. I had plenty of layers and a warm sleeping bag, so I wasn't worried about the cold. After finishing my food, I doused the fire until only glowing embers remained and crawled into my tent, zipping the flap closed. The silence out here was deeper than I had ever experienced, but it was comforting. I slept soundly for a while. Then something woke me. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there, completely still, listening. The air inside the tent was cold now, and my breath came out in faint clouds. It was dead silent, too silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just stillness. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling noise, not close but not far either, somewhere outside my tent, near the tree line. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But as I listened, something felt off. The sound wasn't consistent with an animal moving naturally. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A soft crunching of leaves. Another step, then another. I reached for the small knife I always kept in my sleeping bag. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I didn't want to make any noise. My heart was pounding now, each beat thudding in my ears. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind knocking something loose. Maybe a raccoon searching for food. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. I kept waiting, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I lay there for what felt like hours, my muscles tense, listening to the silence. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, and for a moment, I felt ridiculous for getting so worked up. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, stretching my sore muscles. The forest was back to normal. Birds chirping, the creek flowing, the world alive again. Maybe I really had imagined it. But then I saw them. Footprints. In the dirt, leading from the trees to the edge of my campsite. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful not to track too much dirt around my tent. These were fresh, barefoot. Whoever had made them had walked right up to my campsite, stood there for a while, then turned back the way they came. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. I looked around, scanning the trees, my stomach twisting into knots. Whoever had been here last night had been watching me, standing just outside my tent, listening. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. Every few seconds, I glanced up, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me. But there was no one, just the footprints. As soon as everything was in my truck, I got inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the dirt path, driving faster than I should have, trying to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this. I wasn't alone out there. And whoever it was, they were close enough to touch my tent. I never liked camping. Not in the way some people do, where they say it's their way of escaping, of feeling free. I never got that. But my brother, Derek, loved it. He said there was nothing better than a weekend in the woods. No phone, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the smell of a fire burning low in the dark. So when he invited me on a trip deep in the Hoosier National Forest, I hesitated. Not because I was scared of the woods, but because I didn't want to spend an entire weekend sleeping in the dirt and eating food out of a cooler. But I hadn't seen much of him lately, and I figured I could handle 2 nights. We drove out on a Friday morning, packed tight into his truck with our gear in the back. The forest got denser the farther we went, the highway turning to a cracked back road before finally dissolving into nothing but a narrow, uneven dirt path. I didn't like how far out we were going. The last time we saw another person was a good half-hour back. Some hunter in an old orange vest unloading his truck. After that, nothing but trees and silence. By the time we parked, the sun was starting its slow descent, casting long, creeping shadows between the trees. Derek hopped out of the truck, stretched, and breathed in deep like the air was fresher out here. Maybe it was, but all I could think about was how cold it was going to get at night. We grabbed our packs and hiked another mile in before Derek found a clearing that he liked. It was surrounded by towering pines, a small stream running nearby, which he said would be good for water. The ground was even mostly free of roots. It was a good spot, I had to admit. We got camp set up just as the last of the sunlight bled out of the sky. Fire going, tents up, food cooking. It was almost nice, sitting there with my brother, the fire crackling, the night calm. Almost. Then we heard something. It was distant, faint, like a branch snapping underfoot. I told myself it was an animal. The forest is full of them, right? But then it happened again, closer this time. Not a quick snap, not a sound an animal would make. It was slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully, testing their weight. Derek must have heard it too, because he stopped eating, staring into the dark. I opened my mouth to say something, but he just held up a hand, listening. Then silence. The fire popped, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Derek chuckled, shook his head, and went back to eating. "Probably a deer," he muttered, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I tried to shake it off too, but something about it didn't sit right. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't think it was a deer. Didn't think it was an animal at all. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound had me wide-eyed, heart pounding. It was too quiet between the noises, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I thought I heard something circling our camp, footsteps crunching the leaves just beyond the fire's glow. But every time I sat up to look, there was nothing, just the dark. Morning came slow, and I was relieved when the sun finally started filtering through the trees. Derek was already up, packing a small bag for a hike. He wanted to check out the hills a few miles away, see if he could find a good overlook. I wanted to tell him about the footsteps, about the feeling I had all night, but I didn't. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I didn't want to admit how much the night had gotten to me. We hiked most of the day. The hills were steep, the trees thick, but when we finally reached the top, the view was incredible. Endless rolling forest, nothing but green stretching to the horizon. It should have made me feel small in a good way. Instead, I just felt alone. Then we saw the cabin. It was nestled at the base of the next hill, hidden by the trees. Old, sagging, half-rotted. It looked abandoned, the kind of place people forgot about decades ago. Derek, of course, wanted to check it out. I didn't. Every instinct I had screamed to leave it alone, but he was already halfway down the slope before I could argue. The door hung open, barely clinging to its rusted hinges. The inside was worse than I expected. Dirt and leaves covered the floor, the walls blackened by what looked like old fire damage. But the worst part? Someone had been here recently. A pile of bones sat in one corner, picked clean, stacked in a way that felt deliberate. Next to them, a rusted hunting knife, the blade dark with something I didn't want to think about. And on the walls, deep scratches, like something had been dragged across them over and over. Derek muttered something under his breath, then turned to me, face pale. "Let's go." We didn't run, but we walked fast. Neither of us spoke the whole way back. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, to turn and see someone or something watching, but the forest stayed silent. Too silent. When we reached camp, Derek started packing. "We're leaving," he said, like I was going to argue. I didn't. We loaded up in record time, hiked back to the truck without stopping. The drive back felt longer, the road stretching on forever. Neither of us spoke. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching us go. I haven't been camping since. Derek doesn't bring it up, and neither do I. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, and I wonder if maybe we were never meant to leave that forest at all. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again after what happened last summer. I grew up camping, spending weekends in the woods with my family, cooking over an open fire, and falling asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was supposed to be peaceful, but now, when I close my eyes and think of the woods, all I feel is fear. It started like any other trip. I had a 4-day weekend, and instead of sitting at home, I decided to drive out to a national forest about 2 hours away. I packed my gear: a tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, a first aid kit, and my knife. I always carried one just in case. I wasn't worried about animals or anything, just liked being prepared. The drive was easy. A long, empty highway stretched between miles of dense trees. It was late afternoon when I pulled off the main road onto a dirt path leading to a remote campsite I had found online. Supposedly, it wasn't a popular spot, which was perfect for me. I liked being alone in nature, No screaming kids, no loud groups, just me and the woods. I parked my car at the edge of the site and got out. It was perfect. A small clearing with a fire pit made of stones and plenty of space for my tent. The trees were thick, stretching high into the sky, and the air smelled fresh. I set up camp quickly, unfolding my tent and staking it into the ground before unpacking my supplies. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat there listening to the sounds of the forest. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping in the distance, probably just deer or raccoons. Around 10, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just soft shuffling, like something walking through the grass. I lay still, listening, trying to decide if it was an animal or just the wind. But then I heard something else. Breathing. Not heavy, not loud, but definitely human. I sat up quickly and grabbed my knife, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The sound stopped. Everything was silent except for the pounding in my chest. I waited for what felt like forever, but nothing else happened. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. I lay back down, keeping my knife close, and somehow drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. If someone had been there, they didn't leave any sign. I shook it off and went about my day, hiking a few miles through the woods, taking in the scenery. The trails were empty, just as I had hoped. I spent the day exploring before heading back to camp in the early evening. That night, I built another fire, made dinner, and sat in the quiet darkness, enjoying the solitude. But as the fire burned down to embers, I started feeling uneasy again. The woods felt different, too quiet, no wind, no rustling, just silence. I stayed up as long as I could, keeping the fire going, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Around midnight, exhaustion won, and I crawled into my tent, knife still close by. I woke up again. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. Soft footsteps circled my tent. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded as I gripped the handle of my knife. The steps stopped right behind me, just inches from where I lay. I held my breath, listening. A minute passed, then another. The footsteps started again, moving to the front of the tent, stopping just outside the zippered door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps faded, moving away, deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, gripping my knife, every muscle tense. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone, but I knew what I heard. I packed up immediately. No breakfast, no fire. Just threw everything in my bag, folded up my tent, and got the hell out of there. I didn't care if I was overreacting. Something wasn't right. As I loaded my gear into the car, I felt it again. That eerie silence. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I got in, started the engine, and pulled onto the dirt road, glancing into the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees. Not close, but not far. Just enough to make out the shape of a person. They weren't moving, just watching. I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't look back. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or how long they had been out there. Maybe they were just some messed up camper playing a joke. Maybe not. I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I never thought much about camping alone. I'd done it plenty of times with friends and family, but this time was different. I needed space, time away from the noise, from work, from everything. The woods had always been my escape, a place where I could reset my mind. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campsites, somewhere isolated. That's what I wanted, no people, no distractions. The drive took me 3 hours from my house. The last stretch of the road was rough, barely more than a dirt trail winding through thick trees. I followed an old map and a few notes from an online forum about good off-the-grid camping spots. No cell service, no way to call anyone if something went wrong. That didn't bother me much. I had my gear, food, water, a good knife, and a rifle just in case. I wasn't worried. I parked my truck in a small clearing and hiked another mile into the woods to set up camp. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and pine. Birds chirped in the distance. The wind rattled through the branches, and somewhere far off, I heard the faint rustling of something moving through the underbrush, probably a deer. I found a nice flat spot near a small creek, perfect for fresh water. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small fire before the sun dipped behind the trees. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled, the stars stretched wide across the sky, and I felt at home, just me and the woods. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, and let my thoughts drift. There was no sound beyond the normal night noises: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft flow of water from the creek. Nothing felt off. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in my sleeping bag inside the tent. The night was colder than I expected, but I stayed warm enough. I woke up once, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, because something snapped a branch outside. It was loud enough to jolt me awake, but I didn't panic. Could have been anything: a raccoon, a fox, maybe even a deer wandering through. I listened for a while, but whatever it was didn't come closer, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area a bit, following the creek for a while. I found an old deer stand, weathered and falling apart, nailed high up in a tree. It had been abandoned for years. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints or trash, which reassured me that I was truly alone out here. That night, things felt different. I had built up my fire again, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the flames as the sky darkened. But the woods were quieter than the night before. The usual hum of insects and distant calls of animals had faded. The air was still. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't fear exactly, just a strange tension in my gut, like when you're being watched but can't see who's watching. I climbed into my tent earlier than usual, trying to ignore the feeling. I wasn't scared, I told myself, just tired. The fire outside crackled softly, casting a warm orange glow against the fabric of the tent. I lay there for a while, listening. Nothing. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up to something moving outside my tent. A soft crunch, the unmistakable sound of a footstep on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. My rifle was next to me, within reach, but I stayed still, listening. Another step. Closer. I swallowed hard and reached for the gun as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking. My brain was trying to rationalize, maybe an animal, maybe a bear. But bears don't move like that. This was slow, deliberate. Person. I held my breath. Another step. Right outside my tent now. I could hear breathing. I had to do something. I sat up quickly and flicked on my flashlight, unzipping the tent just enough to see outside. Nothing. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows through the trees, but there was no one there. No movement. No sound. I stepped out slowly, gun raised, scanning the darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the trees, illuminating the thick underbrush. Still nothing, but the feeling hadn't gone away. Someone had been there, watching. I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle in my lap, eyes scanning the dark. I didn't hear another sound. The woods stayed silent until the first light of dawn. I packed up quickly. Something wasn't right here. I had camped in the woods more times than I could count, but I had never felt like this before. That deep, gut-wrenching certainty that I wasn't alone. I didn't bother eating. I threw everything into my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back to my truck. The forest felt different on the way back. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling that same uneasy tension pressing down on me. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the leaves made my heart jump. When I reached the clearing where I had left my truck, I froze. Footprints, fresh ones circling my vehicle. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around, checked the doors. My truck was locked, but that didn't make me feel any better. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I tore down the dirt road, kicking up dust and gravel. I drove until I had cell service again, then pulled over on the side of the highway, hands shaking as I caught my breath. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I didn't see anyone. There was no proof, just a feeling, some footprints. Nothing that would hold up as evidence. I never went back to that spot, never even looked it up again. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about it, about the way the woods fell silent, the footsteps outside my tent, the feeling of being watched, and I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that night ever found another camper to watch. I don't know why I didn't listen to my gut. Something about the place felt wrong from the start, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had planned this solo camping trip for months. Just me, the woods, and silence. I wanted to disconnect from everything, clear my head, and just exist in nature for a while. I even picked a spot way off the beaten path, deep in the national forest, away from people, away from noise. The drive took longer than expected. The forest roads were rough, barely more than dirt trails cutting through the trees. My truck bounced and jerked as I navigated over rocks and potholes. It was early afternoon when I finally found the clearing I had marked on my map. The area was perfect, flat ground, plenty of space for my tent, and a small stream nearby for water. The trees around it were dense, tall pines stretching high into the sky, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. As I stepped out of the truck, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear, not yet, but an unease I couldn't shake. The air felt heavy, like I had just walked into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone out here. No distractions, no background noise of the world. Just me and nature. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent near the tree line and gathering firewood from the surrounding area. The sun dipped lower as I worked, casting long shadows across the clearing. By the time I had a small fire going, the light was fading fast. The sounds of the forest changed as night took over. Birds quieted, replaced by the occasional rustle in the underbrush and the distant hoot of an owl. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and sat back in my camping chair, letting the heat of the flames soak into my skin. The fire crackled, sending embers floating into the dark. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Just me, the stars above, and the deep silence of the woods. But that feeling never really went away. The strange sense that something was off. I told myself it was just the isolation, that my mind wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I tried to ignore it. I should have listened to it. The first thing that unsettled me happened just as I was turning in for the night. I had doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself in. I was lying on my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, when I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, just beyond the clearing. A snap, a branch breaking underfoot. I held my breath, listening. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. My heart pounded. I lay still, barely breathing, straining to hear more. Nothing, just the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves. I told myself it had to be my imagination. The fire had attracted some animal and now it was gone. I forced myself to relax, but it took a long time before I finally drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. The forest was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. No insects, no distant rustling, nothing. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. They stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, another camper, some lost hiker. But deep down, I knew better. The way the steps had moved, slow and purposeful. That wasn't an animal. And if it was a person, why were they just standing there? I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, my fingers closing around the handle. The footsteps didn't move. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just standing there, barely a few feet away. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they retreated. Soft, measured steps moving back into the woods until they faded completely. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife in my shaking hands, listening. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but I knew better. Someone had been there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sky lightened, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, my knife still in my grip. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but I could feel it. Something had changed. My stomach twisted as I scanned the ground near my tent. Footprints. They were human, barefoot, leading from the trees right up to my tent, then back again. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't care about the trip anymore. I just wanted to get out. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me. I didn't see anyone, but that feeling never left. I drove out of there faster than I should have, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow forest road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, civilization finally in sight. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be visited alone. I don't know why I agreed to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe I just needed a break from everything. Work, my phone, people. Or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I wasn't afraid to spend a couple of nights deep in the woods with nothing but a tent and my thoughts. I told myself it would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. I was wrong. The drive out was easy. I'd picked a spot a few hours from home, a state park that wasn't too popular but still had designated camping areas. I didn't want to be around people, but I also didn't want to be completely off the grid. I parked my car at the entrance of the hiking trail and grabbed my gear. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and my knife, just in case. I wasn't stupid. I knew animals roamed the woods, and I wasn't about to be caught unprepared. The hike to my campsite was about 4 miles. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of something in the underbrush. I had this weird feeling in my stomach as I walked, something between excitement and nervousness. I ignored it and kept moving, my boots crunching against the dirt path. I reached my campsite in the late afternoon. It was a decent spot, a small clearing with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit someone had built before me. I set everything up quickly. The tent went up first, then I gathered wood for a fire. By the time the sun started to dip below the trees, I had a small fire going, a can of soup warming over the flames. That first night wasn't bad. The woods got eerily quiet after dark, but I expected that. I ate my soup, watched the fire crackle, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep well, but that was normal for me even at home. Every little noise outside made me tense up, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Bears, mountain lions, some lunatic lurking in the woods. But nothing happened, just the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke up stiff and groggy. I made a quick breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to hike a little deeper into the woods. I didn't go too far, maybe another 2 miles, but I wanted to explore. The woods felt different that day. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt heavier, like the trees were pressing in closer than they had before. I tried to shake it off and kept walking, stopping now and then to take a drink of water and listen to the silence. About an hour into my hike, I found something strange, a pile of bones. At first, I thought they belonged to a deer, maybe something a predator had killed. But as I stepped closer, I realized they were arranged in a pattern. A circle with smaller bones laid out in lines inside it. I felt my stomach twist. It didn't look like something an animal would do. Someone had been here, and they had taken the time to arrange these bones in a deliberate way. I backed away and turned around. I wasn't about to stick around and figure out what it meant. I walked faster than before, my heart pounding in my chest. Every shadow between the trees looked like something watching me. The hike back to my campsite felt twice as long. By the time I got there, I was sweating, even though the air was cool. I sat by my fire pit, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was some kind of weird hunter's tradition. Maybe a group of kids had done it as a prank. I forced myself to eat, though I wasn't hungry. The sun was setting again, and I had no choice but to spend another night here. Leaving in the dark wasn't an option. That night was different. I lay in my tent, my knife close to my hand, listening to the night. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Animals don't walk like that. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. The steps moved closer, stopping just outside my tent. I didn't move. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped again. I waited. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as they came, they were gone. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but I never heard them again. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I didn't eat, didn't even stop to drink water. I just wanted out. The hike back to my car was a blur. Every twig snapping made my heart leap into my throat. When I finally saw my car, I nearly ran to it. I threw my gear into the trunk, jumped in, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I should have turned back when I saw the empty campground. That was my first thought when I pulled up to the entrance of the old state park. There were no other cars, no signs of life at all, except for the dull glow of the ranger station's light in the distance. But I had already driven hours to get here, and I wasn't about to turn around because of a bad feeling. It was early October, the time of year when the nights started getting longer and colder, but I had packed well. I had my tent, plenty of firewood, food, and my hunting knife. More for comfort than any real expectation of needing it. The state park was supposed to be quiet this time of year, and that's what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the cold night air. I checked in at the ranger station, but the place seemed abandoned. The door was locked, and a small note on the window said, "Campsite open. Pick any spot. Register online." That was odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the ranger was out on patrol. I got back in my truck and drove deeper into the park. The campsites were nestled in a thick patch of woods, and the deeper I drove, the darker it got. The trees blocked out most of the remaining light, making it feel later than it really was. My headlights barely cut through the shadows stretching across the narrow road. I finally found a spot near the edge of a dried-up creek bed. It wasn't the best location, but at least it was flat, and I could see a clearing through the trees where the sky was still a pale blue. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going before the sun fully set. The crackling of the fire was the only sound besides the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal forest noises, nothing to worry about. The wind started picking up, pushing the flames sideways and making the shadows dance against the trees. I ate my dinner in silence, watching the fire flicker. I wasn't scared, not really, but there was something off about the place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was too quiet, too still. Even the wind seemed muffled somehow, like the trees were swallowing up the sound. Then I noticed something. The forest smelled different. At first, I thought it was just the firewood burning, but there was something else. Something foul underneath it. It was subtle, but it was there. A sour, rotting scent, like something had died nearby. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the perimeter of my campsite. Nothing, just trees and rocks. But the smell lingered. I told myself it was probably a dead animal somewhere downwind. Maybe a deer that had wandered too far and gotten caught in a ravine. It made sense. The woods were full of things like that. Still, I didn't like it. I stayed close to the fire until my eyelids got too heavy, then crawled into my tent, leaving my knife within reach. The fire outside cast a dim glow through the fabric, and for a while, I just lay there, listening. The wind had died down, and the silence had crept back in. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a crunch. Not the wind, not a branch snapping in the distance. It was close, too close. Something had stepped into my campsite. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. The fire crackled softly outside, but I couldn't hear anything else. I waited, my ears straining, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my own head. Another crunch. This time it was deliberate, slow, careful. I reached for my knife and gripped it tight, debating whether to call out or stay silent. My flashlight was on the other side of the tent, out of reach. My heart pounded harder. Then, another sound, a different one. Breathing, low, heavy breaths, just outside my tent. My mouth went dry. I tightened my grip on the knife. The fire outside wasn't bright enough to cast a clear shadow through the tent walls, but I could see movement. Something was there, standing just a few feet away. And then, just as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The footsteps retreated, slow at first, then fading into the distance. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours before finally daring to move. I reached for my flashlight with shaky hands and clicked it on. The dim light inside the tent felt pitifully weak against the darkness outside. I took a deep breath and forced myself to unzip the tent. The fire was still burning, but it was lower now. The air was colder. I swept the light around the campsite. Nothing. I stood up, still gripping the knife, and took a few slow steps toward the edge of my sight. The smell from earlier was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I fought the urge to gag as I stepped forward, scanning the ground. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not shoes. Bare footprints. Large, wide, pressing deep into the dirt. Leading from the tree line to my tent and then back into the forest. I felt something twist in my gut. These weren't animal tracks. Someone had been standing outside my tent, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my knife in my lap, staring into the darkness, waiting. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more breathing. Just the wind, picking up again as the sky turned gray with the first light of morning. I packed up as soon as the sun rose. I didn't bother eating breakfast, didn't even douse the fire properly. I just wanted to leave. As I drove out of the park, I stopped by the ranger station again, but it was still empty. The same note sat in the window, untouched. I checked my phone once I had service again. No missing persons reports, no news of anything strange happening in the area. Nothing to explain what had happened, but I knew what I had seen. Someone had been out there that night. Someone had been watching me sleep, and I had no idea why. I never wanted to go on the trip. I told myself I was too busy, that I had work to catch up on, that I didn't feel great. But deep down, I think I just had a bad feeling about it. It wasn't anything specific, just a tightness in my chest when my friend, Mark, first brought it up. He had been planning the trip for weeks, picking a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any cell service, far from people. No distractions, he had said. Just us, nature, and a break from the real world. It sounded good in theory, and I let myself get pulled into it. It was supposed to be a weekend of hiking, fishing, sitting by the fire, drinking, and clearing our heads. There were 4 of us: Mark, Dave, Kyle, and me. We had all been friends for years, though life had pulled us in different directions. This trip was meant to bring us back together, like old times. We left early Friday morning, packed up Mark's truck with our gear, and drove for hours into the mountains. The further we got from civilization, the quieter it became. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. Eventually, we reached a point where the truck couldn't go any farther. From there, we had to hike another mile or so to our campsite. The place was beautiful. Towering trees surrounded us, their branches stretching high above, blocking most of the sunlight. A clear, cold river ran nearby, the sound of rushing water filling the air. We set up camp in a small clearing, far enough from the river that we wouldn't wake up soaked if it rained, but close enough that we could hear it. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked some food, and drank a little. Mark and Kyle went down to the river to try fishing, but they didn't catch much. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, listening to the wind in the trees. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That changed the next day. We spent the morning hiking, following a narrow trail deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer. There was something strange about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the trees leaned slightly inward, as if closing us in. Maybe it was the way the wind would pick up suddenly and then vanish, leaving only silence. Then we found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map. It looked old, so old that it shouldn't have been standing. The wood was dark and rotting, the roof sagging, but the door was still intact. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks. It shouldn't have been there, not this deep in the woods. Dave wanted to check it out. I didn't. Something about it made my stomach turn. But Mark and Kyle agreed with Dave, so I went along with them. Inside, the air was thick, stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, empty except for a few rusted cans. A small wooden table sat in the center, its surface covered in dust. But what unsettled me the most was the bed in the corner. The sheets were dirty, but not old. Someone had slept there. Then Kyle pointed something out. A name carved into the wall above the bed. Just one word: leave. We got out of there fast. I don't think anyone said a word on the way back to camp, but I could feel it. That shift in the air, that weight settling over us. No one wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing. We weren't supposed to be there. That night, the woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. The fire didn't feel warm. Felt small, weak. The darkness beyond it felt too big, too empty. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something just beyond the reach of the flames. And then we heard it. A sound, distant but sharp. A snap like a branch breaking. Then another, closer. Probably just an animal, Mark said. His voice was too forced, too flat. None of us slept well. I don't think any of us truly slept at all. I kept my eyes on the darkness, listening. The sound didn't come back, but the feeling did. That gut-deep certainty that we weren't alone. By morning, I was ready to go. I didn't care how it looked. I didn't care if the guys thought I was paranoid. But before we could pack up, Kyle noticed something. Footprints, not ours. Bigger, deeper, leading from the edge of our camp to where we slept, then back into the trees. I don't remember much after that. Just the panic, the rush to grab our gear, the hike back to the truck feeling 10 times longer than it had before. No one spoke. No one needed to. When we finally reached the truck, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything or anyone was watching us. We never talked about it after that. Not really. A few jokes here and there, trying to laugh it off. But I know we all think about it. About the footprints. About that cabin. About the feeling that we had stayed one night too long. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if we were really alone out there at all. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I let my brother, Kevin, get into my head. He'd been on my case for months, calling me soft, saying I'd gotten too comfortable in the city. You need to get out there, he told me. Get your hands dirty again. So I said yes. 5 days in the remote woods, just the two of us, no cell service, no nearby towns. Just miles of trees, a river, and whatever we carried on our backs. Kevin had planned everything, packed our gear, checked the maps. I trusted him. He was the outdoorsman of the family, always had been. He'd done these kinds of trips before. The first day was fine. We parked the truck at the trailhead, hiked 10 miles into the woods, and set up camp near the river. The water was clear, ice cold, and fast-moving. The air smelled clean, like pine and damp earth. It was almost peaceful. The second day, we moved deeper in. Kevin wanted to push further than he had on his last trip, into an area few people ever went. Untouched wilderness, he called it. The hike was rough, the terrain uneven, the trees growing denser. By the time we set up camp, my legs were aching and my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack. But Kevin was grinning like a kid on Christmas. He loved this. That night, I woke up to something moving outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no insects, just the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Heavy but not loud, not an animal. My heart pounded. I reached over, nudging Kevin awake. He grumbled, but when he heard it, he went still. Then silence. We waited, not moving, barely breathing. Nothing. After a few minutes, Kevin unzipped the tent, shining his flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, the river a few yards away, our gear undisturbed. Probably just a deer, he muttered, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, we found tracks near the camp. Not hoof prints, boots. Someone had been walking around while we slept. Kevin tried to play it down, saying it was probably a hunter passing through, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We weren't supposed to be anywhere near a hunting trail. And why would someone be walking around our camp in the middle of the night, then just leave? We packed up and moved on. Kevin didn't want to turn back yet, but I could tell he was unsettled. I was too. We hiked another 8 miles before setting up a new camp near a rocky outcrop. From there, we had a view of the valley below. Miles and miles of endless forest, no sign of civilization. Beautiful and isolating. That night, it happened again. I woke up with the same feeling something was outside. The footsteps were back, moving around the tent, stopping, starting again. I didn't wake Kevin this time. I just lay there, listening, gripping the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The steps stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, more tracks, this time closer. Kevin didn't say much, just broke camp quickly, his movements sharp, impatient. He was done pretending this wasn't a problem. We started back toward the truck. We were at least 2 days away, maybe more if the terrain slowed us down. The whole day, I felt like we were being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, but every time I looked, there was nothing. No movement, no sounds. Even the birds were quiet. That evening, we didn't set up a proper camp. Just rolled out our sleeping bags under a thick tree canopy. No fire, no talking. Kevin stayed awake, knife in hand, watching the woods. I dozed off at some point, exhaustion winning out. Then I woke up, not to sound, not to movement, but to Kevin shaking me, his face pale in the moonlight. He put a finger to his lips, motioning for me to be silent. Then he pointed. There, at the edge of the trees, was a figure, standing still, watching us, not moving, not hiding, just standing there. Couldn't breathe. My body locked up, every muscle screaming for me to run, but I couldn't. I just stared. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, a hood pulled up over their head. I couldn't see a face, just the shape of them against the trees. Then, slowly, they turned and walked away. No rush, no hesitation, just left. Kevin and I sat there until dawn, our knives clutched so tight my fingers went numb. As soon as the sun came up, we ran. Didn't pack, didn't eat, just grabbed what we could and ran. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. Threw our gear in the back and peeled out of there, driving without speaking until we were back on the highway, surrounded by signs of life again. Neither of us has talked about it since. I don't know who that was or what they wanted. Maybe they were just messing with us. Maybe they had something worse in mind. I don't care. I won't be going back out there again. I always liked camping alone. There was something peaceful about it. No noise from the city, no one to bother me, just me and the woods. I had been doing it for years without any problems. So when I took my truck up to a remote part of the national forest for a weekend trip, I didn't think twice about it. The spot I picked was about 20 miles off the main road, down a narrow dirt path that barely looked like it was used anymore. The deeper I drove, the rougher the road got, but I didn't mind. I had a full tank of gas, plenty of food and water, and my gear was all in order. The only thing I needed to worry about was setting up before dark. By the time I found a good clearing, the sun was already getting low. I parked my truck near a fallen tree, unloaded my tent, and got to work. The trees were thick around the site, and the only sounds were birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the leaves. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. Once my tent was set up, I gathered some firewood. There were plenty of dry branches scattered around, and within an hour, I had a decent fire going. I cooked up some canchili, ate straight out of the pot, and washed it down with a cold beer. It was one of those perfect, quiet evenings that made me glad I took the time to get away. As it got darker, the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted down, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I'd been in the woods enough to know that most of what you hear at night is just raccoons, deer, or other harmless animals. At some point, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just that strange, nagging feeling that something is off. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When you're alone in the woods, your brain can make you think all kinds of things. I put more wood on the fire, sat back in my chair, and forced myself to relax. Then I heard it. It wasn't the usual animal noises. It was a dull thud, like something heavy dropping onto the ground. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards away, but it was distinct. I turned my head toward the sound and listened, but everything was silent again. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch falling, but something about it didn't feel right. It sounded deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the thick woods beyond my campsite. I sat back down, trying to shake the uneasiness. I had my knife on my belt and a rifle in the truck. There wasn't much out here that could be a real threat to me. A few minutes later, I heard another noise. This time it was closer. Not a thud, but a soft, deliberate crunching, like footsteps in the underbrush. I stood up, shining my light in the direction of the sound. But again, there was nothing. The fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows against the trees. I waited, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer, but something about the way it moved made me doubt that. A deer wouldn't stop like that, wouldn't freeze in place the second I shined my light. It would either bolt or keep moving. I sat back down, gripping my knife. I wasn't going to let some weird noise ruin my trip. I had been out in the woods plenty of times, and I knew that paranoia could get the best of you if you let it. I forced myself to sit by the fire, sip my beer, and enjoy the night. At some point, I dozed off. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up suddenly to the sound of something brushing against my tent. I shot up, heart hammering, reaching for my flashlight. The fire had died down to embers, casting only a faint glow around the campsite. I flicked on the light and shined it toward my tent. There was nothing there, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I listened, barely breathing. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just dead silence. I stepped closer to my tent, scanning the ground. No tracks, no signs of anything moving around. But the feeling was still there, that heavy, pressing sense that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. Someone was out there, watching me. I backed up toward my truck, keeping my flashlight pointed into the trees. My rifle was in the cab. I debated getting in, locking the doors, and waiting until morning. But something in me resisted the idea. I didn't want to feel trapped. If there was someone out there, I wanted to see them coming. I stoked the fire back to life, the flames pushing the darkness back. I sat down again, this time with my rifle across my lap. I wasn't going to sleep, not until the sun came up. The night dragged on. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. But each time, when I shined my light, there was nothing. It was like whatever was out there was toying with me, staying just out of sight. Then, Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful, just beyond the firelight. I stood up, rifle ready. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hoarse from the long night. Silence. Then something moved, just a flicker of motion in the trees. I aimed my light and caught a glimpse of a figure, just for a second, before it disappeared into the darkness. That was it for me. I wasn't waiting around to see what happened next. I grabbed my gear, tossed it into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I drove fast, faster than I should have on that rough road. But I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway, the sky turning gray with the morning light. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. I've camped 100 times, but I've never felt anything like that before. And I've never gone camping alone again. I remember that night as clearly as if it just happened. The kind of night where everything feels off, but you push it aside because your mind tells you it's nothing. Just nerves, maybe, or exhaustion. But looking back, I should have listened to that feeling. Maybe things would have turned out differently. It started as a simple camping trip. I had been stressed out, worn down by work and life, and I needed a break. Nothing crazy, just a weekend away from everything. A few days in the woods, away from people, away from noise, just me and the quiet. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from the usual campgrounds. I wanted solitude, real solitude. No rangers checking in, no families with loud kids. Just me and the wilderness. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, some basic food, a small propane stove. I had my knife, a hatchet, and a handgun, because even though I wasn't expecting trouble, I wasn't stupid. Animals, people, you never know what you might run into out there. The drive was long, winding roads that turned to gravel, then dirt. No cell service, which was fine by me. I had a map, a compass, and a good sense of direction. I got to the spot in the late afternoon. The trees were thick, towering, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight even before dusk set in. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was quiet, too quiet. I told myself that was the point, but something about it made my skin crawl just a little. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not too far from a narrow creek. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I gathered some wood, got a small fire going, and heated up a can of chili. The silence pressed in around me, heavy. No wind, no rustling, not even the usual distant hoot of an owl. Just me and the crackling fire. As darkness settled, the feeling got worse. Not fear, not yet, just an uneasiness like I was being watched. But that's common when you're alone in the woods. Your mind plays tricks. I told myself that, even though my gut wasn't buying it. I turned in early, laying on my sleeping bag, listening. The forest should be alive at night. Insects, small animals, something. But it was dead silent. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to sleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Something had woken me up. I lay there, frozen, listening. At first, I heard nothing, just my own heartbeat. Then, faintly, something moved outside. Slow, deliberate. Not the skittering of a raccoon or the crunch of a deer passing through. This was careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my exact position. Instead, I stayed still, listening. My gun was within reach, still holstered, but I didn't grab it yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with. The sound moved around the tent, slow and steady. Footsteps. I was sure of it now. Not heavy enough to be a bear, but not light enough for a fox or coyote. My breath was shallow, every muscle tense. Then, nothing. The silence stretched, and I started to think maybe I imagined it. Maybe it had been a deer after all, passing by. I waited a little longer, then slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light, but beyond that, only darkness. I strained my eyes, searching the trees, but saw no movement. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I closed the tent, keeping my gun close this time. Sleep was out of the question. I lay there waiting, listening. Hours passed, but I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. Morning came too soon. The first thing I did was check around the tent. First, everything seemed normal. No signs of anything unusual. Then I saw them, footprints. Human footprints. They circled my tent, stopping just feet from the entrance before turning back into the trees. A chill ran through me. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and they hadn't made a move, at least not yet. I packed up fast. My plan had been to stay another night, but that idea was gone. I didn't want to stick around to find out who had been there or what they wanted. I kept my gun in my hand as I moved, scanning the trees, every nerve on edge. The hike back to my car was the longest of my life. Every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I felt exposed, like I was being watched the whole way. But I saw no one, no movement, just the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. When I finally reached my car, I wasted no time throwing my gear in the back and getting out of there. The whole way back, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't want to. But I do know one thing. Next time I feel that gut-deep sense of something being wrong, I won't ignore it. Because sometimes the worst things out there aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're just people. I've always enjoyed camping, but this trip was different. This trip left me with something I can't shake, something that still makes me uneasy in ways I can't explain. I keep thinking about how close I came to something terrible, something real. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural, just people, just the world. And that's what makes it worse. It started out as a solo trip. I'd camped alone plenty of times before, and I actually preferred it. Something about being out there with just a tent, a fire, and the sound of the woods. It always felt peaceful. I chose a secluded spot deep in a national forest, far from any designated campground. I liked being away from people, away from the noise. I found a clearing by a small river, perfect for setting up camp. The place was beautiful, untouched. I could hear the water moving over rocks, the wind moving through the trees. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. I set up my tent, got my firewood together, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun started to set, the world around me softened into that perfect golden glow. I sat by the fire, listening to the night settle in. The only sounds were the usual ones, crickets, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt completely alone, just the way I liked it. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just had that strange, uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I listened. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no rustling. That wasn't normal. Then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, too heavy for a small animal. Something was moving out there. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound was coming from the trees to my left, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I couldn't see anything. My fire had burned down too much to throw any real light. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon searching for food. But I didn't move. I just listened. The sound stopped. The woods stayed silent for a long time. I lay back down, but I didn't close my eyes. My body was tense in a way I couldn't shake. I stayed like that for maybe an hour before exhaustion won out and I fell asleep again. The next morning, I felt stupid. I told myself it had been nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dark. I ate breakfast, hiked a bit, fished in the river, and tried to enjoy the day. And I did. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and everything felt normal again. By the time night came, I had almost forgotten about the strange silence from the night before. Almost. But then, around the same time, I woke up again. I didn't hear anything at first, but that same uneasy feeling was back. I lay still, listening. The night was quiet. but not in the unnatural way it had been before. I could hear the usual sounds, the wind, the occasional chirp of an insect. But then there was something else, something faint. A light tapping sound, like something knocking against wood. I stayed completely still. The sound was coming from the same direction as before, somewhere in the trees. It wasn't loud, just steady. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening. The tapping stopped. Then suddenly a different sound. A quiet shuffling, like someone shifting their weight on the ground. My stomach dropped. This wasn't an animal. I knew that now. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, knife in hand, listening. The sounds didn't come back, but that didn't make me feel any better. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things. I wasn't about to stick around to find out who or what was out there, but as I was packing up, I found something. About 10 feet from my tent, near the tree line, there was a small pile of rocks. I hadn't put it there. The rocks were stacked carefully, one on top of the other. It wasn't natural. Someone had done this. Someone had been near my tent while I slept. I didn't waste any more time. I finished packing, threw everything in my backpack, and got the hell out of there. I hiked fast, barely stopping. My heart was pounding the whole time, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But I never did. I reached my car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally did, I sat there, breathing hard, trying to calm down. I kept thinking about that tapping sound, the pile of rocks. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching me. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. And I don't want to know. I still go camping. I still love it. But I don't camp alone anymore. I don't know why I decided to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe I needed to clear my head, get away from the noise of life, or just prove to myself that I could do it. I had been camping plenty of times before, but always with friends or family. This time it was just me, my truck, and a stretch of isolated forest. I picked a spot deep in the woods, well off the main road. There was a small, narrow dirt path leading into the trees, barely visible from the highway. I had to drive slowly to avoid potholes and large rocks. My truck bounced and groaned, but eventually, I found a decent clearing. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by thick trees, and far from any other campers. I set up my tent near a fallen log and gathered some firewood while there was still light. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. I felt at ease. The stress that had weighed on me all week began to fade as I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air. I leaned back in my folding chair, watching the flames dance. It was peaceful. No phone, no emails, no people, just me and the forest. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. I threw more wood onto the fire, staring out into the darkness beyond the flickering light. The trees loomed around me, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. It was then that I noticed how truly alone I was. There was a feeling that settled in my gut. Not fear, not yet, just an awareness. The kind you get when you walk into a dark room and know something isn't quite right. I shook it off. I was in the middle of the woods. Of course, it was going to feel eerie. I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire with water, watching the steam rise, and crawled into my sleeping bag. My tent was small, just enough room for me and my gear. The nylon walls felt thin, barely a barrier between me and the vast forest. I fell asleep quickly but woke up sometime later. Something had pulled me out of my sleep. I listened. The forest was still, too still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no crickets. Just silence. Then a sound. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Footsteps. Not the quick, skittering kind made by animals, but something heavier, more deliberate. I held my breath. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, maybe a bear? But the steps were steady, unhurried, like someone walking. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees outside my tent. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I waited. The silence pressed in. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing my breathing to slow. Just as I started to drift off again, the footsteps returned. Closer this time. I shot up, heart pounding. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I grabbed the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. My grip was tight, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, shallow, measured. I had to do something. My mind screamed at me to run, but I knew I was trapped. If I unzipped the tent and bolted, I'd be exposed. If I stayed, I was a sitting duck. Then the zipper of my tent moved, just a few inches. I reacted instantly, swinging the flashlight toward the opening. The beam caught something, a glimpse of a hand. Dirty, rough, fingers curled around the fabric. I lunged forward, slamming the knife against the tent wall, hoping to scare whoever it was. The hand jerked back. Footsteps retreated, fast, crashing through the underbrush. I tore open the tent and burst out, flashlight scanning wildly. Nothing, just the trees, the darkness, and the heavy pounding of my own heart. I stood there, shaking, my breath visible in the cold night air. Whoever it was, they were gone. But for how long? I had to leave. Now, I shoved my sleeping bag and gear into the truck without bothering to pack properly. The fire pit was still smoldering as I threw myself into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the trees. I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me, but there was nothing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My mind raced with what had just happened. I never saw who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't reacted fast enough, I might not be here to tell this story. I haven't been camping alone since. I don't think I ever will again. I have always loved camping, being out in the quiet of the woods with nothing but the crackling fire and the hum of insects to keep me company. There's something about being away from the noise of life, away from responsibilities, and just living simply for a few days. That's why, when I had the chance to take a solo camping trip in early October, I jumped on it. I had done it before and I wasn't worried. If anything, I was looking forward to the solitude. I chose a spot deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. It was a primitive site, no running water, no marked trails, just a clearing near a small creek. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the afternoon, parked my truck at the edge of a narrow dirt path, and hiked in about a mile to where I planned to set up camp. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning shades of orange and red, and everything smelled like damp earth and pine. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the creek, gathered enough firewood to last me the night, and spent the evening cooking over the flames, watching the sky turn dark. It was peaceful. No one else was around. I hadn't even seen another car on the road in. Just me, the woods, and the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, waking only once to the distant sound of a coyote howling. The next morning, I made coffee over the fire, packed a small bag, and decided to explore. The area wasn't mapped, but I had a compass and a good sense of direction. I walked along the creek for a while, following its winding path through the woods. The further I went, the quieter everything seemed to become. No birds, no insects, just silence. I figured it was the time of year. Maybe animals were starting to hunker down for winter. I came across an old hunting stand, rotting and half-collapsed near the base of a tree. A few empty shell casings lay in the dirt nearby, rusted from age. It was clear no one had used it in a long time. As I walked around, I noticed something odd. Tree trunks with deep gashes in them, like something had clawed through the bark. Maybe a bear, I thought. But the marks were strange, too spaced out to be a bear's swipe. I didn't dwell on it. I had my knife and I wasn't too worried. I spent the rest of the day hiking, enjoying the solitude, and eventually made my way back to camp before dark. As I built my fire for the night, I had this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after spending all day alone in unfamiliar woods. Still, I kept my knife close and made sure my fire stayed big. That night, something woke me up, a snapping sound. Not the usual rustling of small animals. This was heavier, deliberate. I sat up, my breath fogging in the cold air, and listened. More snapping, like twigs breaking underfoot, coming from the trees behind my tent. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the noise. Nothing, but the feeling was still there. That creeping, uncomfortable feeling of being watched. I stayed still for a long time, listening, before finally convincing myself it was just a deer or some other animal wandering too close. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though it took a while. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the edge of my campsite, the dirt was disturbed, like something had been dragged. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but there was a clear mark where something had moved through. It led into the trees, but I didn't follow it. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal. Maybe a coyote had dragged off some prey during the night. That's what I told myself. I should have left then, packed up and gone home. But I didn't. I pushed the unease down and told myself I was being paranoid. I had come here to get away, to enjoy the quiet. I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin that. That evening, I was more on edge. I kept my fire burning bigger and brighter than the night before, and I made sure to keep my flashlight and knife within arm's reach. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, just that thick silence that made everything feel unnatural. Then, just as I was finishing up my meal, I heard it again, that snapping. But this time it was closer, too close. My stomach dropped. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. A figure stood just beyond the light's reach. First, I thought it was a person, someone tall, standing completely still between the trees. But as I strained my eyes, something felt off. The proportions weren't right. The head seemed too low on the shoulders, the arms too long at the sides. It didn't move. It just stood there. I felt frozen. My body screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to move, didn't want to draw attention to myself. My hand tightened around the knife in my lap. I stared at the figure for what felt like forever, my heart hammering, my breathing shallow. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I don't mean it walked away. I mean it was just gone. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. That was enough. I was done. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and abandoned everything else. My tent, my food, my gear, I left it all. I wasn't about to stay and see what happened next. I ran through the woods with nothing but my flashlight cutting through the darkness, expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I made it back to my truck, threw myself inside, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't care about leaving my stuff behind. I could replace all of it. What I couldn't replace was whatever sense of safety I had lost in those woods. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. I never went back to get my gear. I never went back to that area at all. And I haven't been camping alone since. Maybe it was just my imagination, just shadows playing tricks on my tired mind. Maybe, but some part of me knows better. Some part of me knows that something was out there watching me, and whatever it wasn't human. I always liked camping, but after what happened last summer, I don't think I can ever go again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend in the woods. Just me, my truck, a tent, and a few days away from people. I picked a spot deep in the forest, off an old logging road that wasn't on any official maps. I had found it on Google Earth, scouted it out a week before, and it seemed perfect. Secluded, quiet, and far from any tourists or other campers. The drive there took longer than I expected. The road was rough, filled with potholes and washed out sections, but my truck handled it fine. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky. I wasted no time setting up my tent near the treeline, close enough to get some shade but far enough to have a clear view of the stars. After setting up, I made a fire and cooked some simple food, just hot dogs and canned beans. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. As the fire crackled and the night settled in, I leaned back in my camping chair, enjoying the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional rustling in the bushes, and the distant call of an owl. Then, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The crickets had gone silent. That alone wasn't too strange. Sometimes predators pass through, and the smaller creatures go quiet, but this felt different. There was no wind, no sound at all, just silence. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the treeline. Nothing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The sun had set, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I shook it off and went to bed, making sure my truck was locked before I crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy steps of a bear or the quick rustling of a deer, but slow, deliberate steps. Human steps. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps moved around the campsite, crunching over twigs and dry leaves. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly as I lay there, barely breathing. The steps stopped just outside my tent. Whoever it was, they were standing right there. I forced myself to stay still. I thought about calling out, but something in me knew that would be a mistake. Instead, I listened. Nothing. Just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I got out of my tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. It made no sense. I checked the truck. Doors still locked. Everything where I left it. I told myself it must have been my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I should have left then, but I convinced myself to stay. I had come all this way, and I wasn't about to let some weird noises ruin my trip. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area, trying to shake off the unease. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it had just been a dream. Then, as I was making dinner, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My tent was unzipped. Not all the way, just a few inches. Enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. I would have noticed. I checked inside, but everything was still there. My sleeping bag, my gear, my knife untouched. It didn't make sense. If someone had come into my campsite while I was gone, why wouldn't they take anything? I felt exposed, vulnerable. But again, I convinced myself to stay. Maybe the wind had shifted the zipper slightly. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. I forced myself to eat, to act normal, but every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the treeline, scanning for movement. That night, I barely slept. Every sound had me on edge. Every creak of a tree, every rustle in the leaves. But nothing happened. By morning, I was exhausted. I made coffee and sat by the fire, trying to clear my head. That's when I noticed something new. There were footprints in the dirt near my truck. Barefoot prints. And they weren't mine. They were fresh. The morning dew had settled on everything except for the tracks. Whoever had been outside my tent last night had been standing just a few feet from my truck, watching. That was it. I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I threw everything into the truck and got out of there, tearing down the road as fast as I could without wrecking. My heart didn't stop pounding until I was back on the highway. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They were watching me. I haven't been camping since. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't getting too soft, or maybe I was just tired of saying no. Either way, when my friend Eric asked if I wanted to go camping with him and his cousin Jason, I agreed. I should have listened to my gut and made up an excuse, but I didn't. We planned for a 3-day trip deep in the woods, far from any town or people. Jason had a spot he swore by, somewhere he and his dad used to go hunting when he was younger. It was about a 2-hour drive out, followed by a long hike through rough terrain. I had camped before, but nothing this deep, nothing this isolated. We left early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise as we packed up Jason's truck and hit the road. The first hour was easy: paved roads, gas stations, civilization. Then the roads got worse, turning into cracked asphalt, then gravel, and finally just dirt. The deeper we went, the fewer signs of people we saw. No houses, no streetlights, no traffic. Eventually, Jason pulled the truck onto a narrow path barely wide enough for it. The trees pressed in from both sides, the ground uneven and scattered with rocks. After what felt like forever, he finally parked in a small clearing. "This is it," he said, stretching as he got out. The place looked untouched. No campsites, no fire pits, no trails. Just thick forest and silence. We grabbed our packs and started the hike. Jason led the way, moving through the trees like he had done it 100 times. Eric followed, and I took up the rear. The air was thick and humid, and the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders. The deeper we went, the harder it got. The ground was uneven, the roots and rocks waiting to catch a careless foot. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, making it feel later than it was. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, we reached the spot Jason had in mind. A small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the distant sound of water. We set up camp, pitching our tents and gathering wood for a fire. The first night was uneventful. We ate, talked, and listened to the sound of the woods. It wasn't until I lay in my tent, staring at the dark fabric above me, that I started feeling off, like something was just outside, watching. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the deep woods were always quiet, that I was just used to the distant hum of cars or the occasional voice carrying through a campground. I forced myself to sleep. The second day, we went deeper into the woods, following a deer trail Jason claimed led to a ridge with a great view. It was a brutal hike, the trail barely a trail at all. Half the time, we had to push through thick undergrowth, using our knives to clear the way. The deeper we went, the stronger that feeling got. Like we weren't supposed to be there. Then we found it. It was an old, rusted-out truck, half buried in the earth. It must have been there for decades, the metal eaten away by time and weather. The windows were gone, the tires rotted down to nothing. The doors were shut, and no amount of pulling would open them. "How the hell did this even get out here?" Eric muttered, running a hand over the rusted surface. There were no roads, no trails big enough for a vehicle to get through. It made no sense. Jason circled the truck, then stopped. "Hey, look at this." We walked over, and my stomach dropped. There were deep scratches in the metal, long and jagged, like something had tried to claw its way in or out. "Nope," I said. "Nope, I'm done." Jason laughed. "Relax. It's probably just from time and weather." I didn't buy that. I didn't buy any of it. We left the truck behind and continued on, but the feeling never left. That night, as we sat by the fire, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see something step out. Then we heard it. It started as a distant crack, like a branch breaking. Then another, closer. We grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the trees. Nothing, just endless darkness. Then Jason screamed. I spun around, my light catching something moving fast. Too fast. Jason was on the ground, clutching his leg. Something got me. We ran to him. His pant leg was torn, blood seeping through the fabric. Something had slashed him. We didn't sleep that night. We kept the fire burning, our backs to each other, waiting for whatever was out there to come back. first light, we packed up. Jason could barely walk, his legs stiff and painful. We had to half carry him, moving as fast as we could. We made it back to the truck, threw our gear in, and got the hell out of there. None of us spoke on the drive back. When we got home, Jason went to the hospital. The doctor said the wound was deep, but clean, like it had been made by a knife. We never found out what really happened. No footprints, no signs of anything. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. It wasn't my first time, and I've always loved the quiet of the woods. But there's a difference between being alone and feeling alone. I didn't understand that until I made the mistake of hiking too deep into the forest, too far away from anyone who could hear me scream. I left early that morning, packing light, just enough for 2 nights. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food, water, my knife, and my old bolt-action rifle. I didn't think I'd need it, but I brought it out of habit. I told a few people where I was going, but I didn't give exact details. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the trees, no distractions, no noise from the world. I parked my truck at the edge of the state land, strapped on my pack, and walked in. The first few miles were easy, the trail well-worn, but I wanted to get away from the main paths, so I veered off and started trekking deeper. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. The ground was soft but dry, and there were no signs that anyone had camped there recently. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and made a small fire as the sun dipped lower. The air was cool, the smell of damp earth and pine strong around me. It was exactly what I wanted. I ate my dinner, just a can of beans and some jerky, then sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The woods around me were dark, but I wasn't afraid. I knew the sounds of the forest, the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was all normal. I stayed up for a while, letting the heat of the fire warm my face, before finally crawling into my tent and zipping myself inside my sleeping bag. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow against the walls of my tent. Everything was silent, too silent. The usual sounds of the forest. No wind, no crickets, nothing had stopped. I strained my ears, listening for anything. Then, in the distance, I heard something. Footsteps, not an animal, not the clumsy movement of a deer or the soft scurrying of a raccoon. These were slow, deliberate steps, the sound of someone moving through the undergrowth. I held my breath, my hand slipping toward my knife. The steps stopped. I stayed frozen, waiting. Then, after what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to paranoia. I made breakfast, drank some coffee, and decided to explore the area. I walked up along the creek for a while, following it through the trees. The sun was high, warm, and the air smelled fresh. The night before felt like a bad dream. Then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the opposite direction, stopping a few yards from my campsite, then turning back into the woods. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here, watching. I scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. I told myself it could have been another hiker, maybe a hunter, but the prints were close, too close. They had stood right outside my tent. I decided to pack up. The whole way back to my truck, I felt it, that prickling on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I moved quickly, gripping my rifle tight. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shift of the wind sent my heart pounding. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, relief washed over me. I threw my pack in the bed and climbed in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I looked around one last time. The woods were still empty. As I drove away, I thought about the footprints, about how close they had been, about how, if I hadn't woken up, I wouldn't have even known someone was there. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know if they were just watching, or if they were waiting for something. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. The road to the campsite was nothing but dirt and gravel, winding through the thick woods. My tires crunched over loose stones, and I could hear the hum of the engine against the quiet of the forest. The air smelled damp, like moss and old leaves, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and lingers in your nose. I was alone, which was exactly how I wanted it. A break from everything: work, the city, people. Just me, a tent, and the woods. I parked at the designated spot, a little pull-off from the main trail. The spot was secluded, far enough away from the next campsite that I wouldn't hear a soul. That was the point. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed, double-checked my supplies: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, knife, and started toward the clearing I had picked out on the map. The forest felt dense, even during the day. Tall pines blocked most of the sunlight, casting long, narrow shadows over the ground. The air was still, almost too still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional creak of branches shifting overhead. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Too much time in the city had made me forget what real silence sounded like. The clearing was just how I expected. Flat, open enough for my tent, but surrounded by trees on all sides. It was near a stream, which would be useful for washing up and keeping cool. I set up my tent quickly, pushing the stakes deep into the ground. The soil was soft but firm, good for holding in place. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, placed my knife by the entrance, and stood up to stretch. I built a small fire as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The orange glow flickered against the trunks, stretching my shadow long and distorted. I ate a quick meal of jerky and granola, washing it down with bottled water. The quiet was starting to settle into me, making me feel more relaxed. This was what I needed. As the fire died down, I decided to take a short walk to the stream. My boots crunched softly against the dirt, and I could hear the trickle of water ahead. The stream was shallow, the water dark and smooth. I crouched down, splashing some on my face, letting the cold seep into my skin. Felt good. Then, something shifted behind me, a branch snapping. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just trees, just shadows. I stood up, my body tense. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, something about the silence that followed unnerved me. No rustling, no retreating footsteps. Just quiet, too quiet. I walked back to my tent, my steps a little faster. The fire was almost out, just glowing embers now. I added another log, watching as the flames curled around it, crackling back to life. It made me feel a little better. I shook off the feeling and crawled into my tent, zipping it closed behind me. I kept my knife close, just in case. I wasn't scared, just cautious. Sleep came slowly. The ground was hard beneath my back, the sounds of the woods unfamiliar. Every creak, every rustle made me open my eyes. I told myself it was just nature doing its thing. I was fine. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Not groggy, not slowly, just awake. Alert. My body was stiff, my breathing shallow. Something had woken me. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind, maybe. I turned onto my side, trying to settle back in. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Close. I stopped breathing. My mind raced. An animal? No, these were human steps. Careful. Measured. Not stumbling through the woods like a deer or a bear. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. The steps stopped just outside my tent. Right outside. I could hear breathing, steady and slow. My hand gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, like someone was pressing against it. Feeling it, testing it. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just listened. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. Slow, fading into the woods. Gone. I didn't move for a long time. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? A ranger? Someone messing with me? None of it made sense. I wasn't near any major trails, and no ranger would sneak up to a tent in the middle of the night without calling out first. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, though it was restless. Every little noise made my eyes snap open. When the morning light finally came, I crawled out of the tent, stiff and exhausted. The fire was out, just ashes now. The woods were the same as before, quiet and indifferent. But something was different. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. And there, near the entrance, was a single handprint. Smudged into the dirt, fingers splayed wide. Watching, I packed up fast. No breakfast, no second thoughts. I shoved everything into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and started back to my truck. My skin prickled the whole way, like something was watching me, following me. I made it to my truck and locked the doors before I even started the engine. The drive back felt longer, the trees pressing in on either side of the road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't want to know. I never went back to that campsite. I never told anyone the full story. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know I wasn't alone. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe because I need to get it out of my head. Maybe because I don't want to forget the details, even though I already know I'll never stop seeing them every time I close my eyes. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Nothing special. Just me, a tent, and a weekend away from all the noise. I'd done this plenty of times before, camping alone in the woods, just enjoying the quiet. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campsites. No people, no sounds of the road, just the woods. That's what I wanted. I parked my truck at the end of an old dirt road, locked it up, and started the hike in. I had everything I needed: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food, a water filter, and my knife. I always carried a knife, even though I'd never had to use it for anything but cutting rope or slicing up firewood. The hike took about an hour. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees got, the more isolated I felt. That's what I wanted. No distractions, no cell service. Just me and the forest. I found a spot that felt right. A small clearing surrounded by trees, but open enough to see the sky. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire. Everything was perfect. As the sun started to go down, the air got cooler, and the forest started to change. Birds quieted down. The wind in the trees sounded different, lower somehow. That's normal, I told myself. The forest is always louder in the day, quieter at night. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and sat by the fire for a while, just listening. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire had died down, just glowing embers left. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Not wind, not the usual small sounds of the forest at night. Something deliberate. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. I've heard them move through the woods before. They can sound bigger than they are. I waited a long time, but nothing happened. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up to a snapping sound. A loud one, like a branch breaking underfoot. My eyes opened, and I stayed completely still. I could feel my heart pounding. I listened. Silence. Then, another sound. Closer. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate step. Not a deer. Not an animal. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had my knife. I wasn't defenseless. Maybe it was just some lost hiker. But why wouldn't they call out? Why would they be walking so slowly, so carefully? I sat up, still gripping the knife. The sound had stopped again. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, just waiting, listening. Eventually, my breathing slowed, and I started to convince myself that maybe it had been my imagination, that maybe the fire had cracked and made a sound I misunderstood. I lay back down, still holding the knife, and closed my eyes. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but this time I knew I wasn't imagining things. There was something right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady. Too steady. I stayed completely still. My knife was still in my hand, but I didn't move. Couldn't. The breathing continued. Then a soft sound. The faintest scrape of something against the nylon of my tent. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I forced myself to stay silent. Whoever, whatever it was, they were right there. They knew I was inside. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. I didn't move. I didn't dare to. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. The forest was silent again. At some point, the sun started to rise, and I finally forced myself to move. Slowly, I unzipped the tent. I looked out. Nothing. I stepped out, my legs shaking. The fire was nothing but cold ash. The clearing looked the same as before, but then I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Human. They circled my tent. I packed up my gear faster than I ever have in my life. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother with the fire. I just grabbed my things and started walking. Fast. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time. The hike back felt longer. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The forest was quiet. When I finally saw my truck, I almost ran to it. I threw my pack in the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know why they just stood outside my tent, breathing, waiting. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I turned onto the long dirt road leading into the forest. The sun hung low, bleeding orange light through the trees, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A weekend alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people, and most of all, away from work. I pulled into the clearing I had marked on my map earlier, a secluded spot near a small lake. No official campground, just raw, untouched wilderness. Perfect. I killed the engine, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let the silence wash over me. No cars honking, no conversations buzzing in my ears, just the distant call of birds and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent under the thickest patch of trees to shield me from any unexpected rain. The firewood took a bit longer to gather, but by nightfall I had a small fire going. The warmth felt good against the cool night air, and I sat back in my folding chair, watching the flames dance. I let my mind drift, enjoying the peaceful solitude, but something felt off. First, I ignored it, just my mind playing tricks on me, adjusting to the silence. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, a nagging sensation settled in my gut, a feeling of being watched. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just thick woods stretching into the dark. I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the middle of nowhere could mess with your head if you let it. I forced myself to relax and ate a quick meal before crawling into my tent. The night was cold, but I bundled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the occasional chirp of insects and the rustling of wind through the trees. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me up. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming sense of wrongness. I lay still, my breath shallow, ears straining for any noise outside the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow on the canvas walls. Then I heard it. Not a snap of a twig or the call of an animal, just breathing. Heavy, deliberate, close. I froze. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. The sound was human. Slow, deep breaths, just outside my tent. I barely dared to move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. If I turned it on, would I regret it? I forced myself to take a slow breath. Then, in one motion, flicked the light on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The firelight barely reached the edge of the clearing, and beyond that was just inky blackness. But I knew I had heard something. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slowly zipped the tent back up. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had read stories of campers waking up in a panic, convinced something was watching them, only to realize it was nothing. Maybe that's all this was. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slow, the weak sunlight filtering through the trees. I crawled out of my tent, stretching my stiff limbs, and checked the area around my camp. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything creeping around. I shook my head, feeling foolish. I had let my imagination get the best of me. Determined to shake off the unease, I spent the morning fishing at the lake. The water was calm, the air crisp, and for a while I felt normal again. The feeling of being watched was gone, and I convinced myself that last night had been nothing but paranoia. That is, until I got back to camp. My backpack wasn't where I left it. I frowned, scanning the area. It had been sitting by my tent when I left, but now it was on the other side of the fire pit, half unzipped. I checked inside. My food was still there, my flashlight, my knife. Everything was untouched. But the fact that it had been moved at all sent a cold chill down my spine. I hadn't imagined this. Someone had been here, while I was gone. I stood still, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed distant, muted. My mouth felt dry. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. I had to make a decision, pack up and leave or stay another night. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but another part of me, the stubborn, rational part, argued that I was overreacting. I had driven hours to get here. Maybe a raccoon had messed with my bag. Maybe the wind. Against my better judgment, I stayed. I spent the rest of the day gathering more firewood, making sure I had enough to keep a blaze going all night. I ate dinner, forced myself to relax, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I threw more logs on the fire, keeping it big and bright. Night settled in. The feeling of unease never left. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, staring into the dark. Every so often, I swore I saw movement between the trees, shadows shifting, but every time I stood to get a better look, nothing was there. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The breathing, slow, deep, but this time it wasn't outside my tent. It was coming from the woods. I gripped my knife tighter, barely daring to breathe myself. The fire crackled, casting flickering light against the trees, but I saw nothing. Then a branch snapped, closer this time. I stood up. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? My car was parked at the edge of the clearing, a good 20 yards away. I'd have to cross through the darkness to get to it. Another snap, then another. I didn't wait to see what was making the sound. I bolted. My feet pounded against the dirt as I sprinted for my car. The fire cast my shadow long and distorted against the trees. I fumbled for my keys, my breath ragged, my heart slamming against my ribs. As I reached the driver's side door, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. Something was standing at the edge of the firelight, tall, still, watching. I didn't wait. I threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Person? Some drifter lurking in the woods? Maybe, maybe not. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and I never will camp alone again. I never liked camping, but I went anyway. It was one of those trips where you don't really have a choice. My brother, Ryan, had planned the whole thing. 3 nights deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. Unplugging, he called it. I called it an unnecessary inconvenience. But I didn't want to be the one to back out, so I packed my bag, threw in some extra layers, and drove out to meet the group. It was just four of us. Ryan, his friend Derek, Derek's younger brother Matt, and me. We had all been friends growing up, but I wasn't particularly close with Derek or Matt anymore. Life happened, but Ryan insisted it would be fun, just like old times. The drive was long, mostly dirt roads once we passed the last gas station. We parked in a clearing where the trees started to thin out and hiked the last 3 miles into the woods. It was late September, the kind of weather where it's warm during the day but drops fast at night. I wasn't thrilled about that. We carried everything on our backs: tents, food, water filters, the works. The first few hours of hiking weren't bad. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. The trees were thick on either side, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under our boots. Every now and then, Derek would stop to check his GPS. He had preloaded the maps since there was no signal out here. The campsite was next to a river, tucked between 2 ridges. We wanted a place with a natural water source so we wouldn't have to carry as much. By the time we got there, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The river was low, just a few inches deep, running smooth over round stones. The clearing was big enough for all our tents with room to sit around the fire. We set everything up quickly, got a fire going, and cooked some of the hot dogs we had packed. It was fine. I wasn't having the time of my life, but it was fine. That night, the cold crept in fast. We all turned in early, exhausted from the hike. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the wind move through the trees. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just movement, soft, slow steps on the leaves. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal, but something about it felt off. Then it stopped right outside my tent. I told myself it was my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. I shut my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. If anyone else had heard something, they didn't mention it. We made coffee, ate some protein bars, and packed up for a day of hiking. Ryan wanted to explore further up the ridge, maybe find a better spot for fishing. It sounded exhausting, but again, I wasn't about to be the one to complain. The hike was brutal. The incline was steep, and the ground was soft from recent rain. We slipped more than once, catching ourselves on tree roots and branches. About 2 miles in, we found a clearing with an old fire pit, just blackened stones and a few charred logs. "Looks like someone camped here before," Matt said, but it didn't look recent. The fire pit was old, the logs scattered. No footprints, no signs of life, just a place someone had used once and abandoned. We didn't linger, kept moving. By midday, we were at the top of the ridge, looking down at miles of unbroken forest. The river was a thin, silver line cutting through the trees. It was beautiful, sure, but all I could think about was how far we were from everything. Then Derek found the bones. They were small, scattered near the base of a tree. Not human, probably a deer or something similar, but they were clean, too clean, picked dry. No fur, no remnants of flesh, just white bone, like they'd been sitting there for months, untouched. "Coyotes, maybe?" Ryan said, but there were no bite marks, no signs of an animal tearing at them. It was strange, but none of us wanted to make a big deal about it. So we left. That night, back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I expected to see something staring back. The fire was warm, the conversation was normal, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I was dreading going to sleep. I woke up to movement again. This time it was louder. I could hear the distinct sound of twigs snapping. Someone or something was walking around our camp. Then came the breathing. Slow, deep breaths just outside my tent. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding, waiting for it to go away. Didn't. The zipper of my tent moved. Not fast, not like an animal pulling at it. Slow, deliberate, like someone testing it. I scrambled for my knife, gripping it so hard my hand shook. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated. The breathing faded. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The ground was disturbed. Leaves shuffled, Dirt shifted, but no tracks. Nothing to prove something had been there. The others woke up slowly, groggy, unaware of anything strange. I wanted to leave, right then, but no one else seemed worried, and I didn't want to sound crazy, so I stayed. That day, we stuck close to camp. No more hiking, just fishing, gathering firewood. The air was tense, but no one said anything. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire long after the others had gone to bed, listening. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. A figure, not an animal, person, standing just at the edge of the firelight, watching, not moving, just standing there. I couldn't see a face, couldn't tell anything except that it was tall. I blinked, and it was gone. That was enough for me. At first light, I woke the others and told them we had to go. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. Something was out there, watching, waiting. We packed up fast, moving quicker than we ever had before. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The feeling never left. When we finally reached the car, I felt like I could breathe again. We never talked about it. Not really, but I know they felt it too. I haven't been camping since. The drive up the mountain was rough. The old Forest Service road was full of ruts and loose gravel, and I had to grip the wheel tight to keep my truck steady. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense pine trees. I had planned this trip for months. A solo weekend in the wilderness, far away from work, people, and noise. I wanted the silence, the stillness, the isolation. I finally reached the spot I had picked out on the map. It was a clearing just off the road, tucked between towering pines with a small stream nearby. No official campsite, just raw forest. I killed the engine and stepped out. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. The only sound was the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I set up my tent quickly, wanting to get a fire going before dark. The air was crisp, and I knew the temperature would drop fast once the sun disappeared. I collected firewood, snapping dead branches and stacking them near a fire pit I built with rocks. When the fire was lit, I sat back in my camping chair, watching the flames flicker and twist, the wood crackling in the quiet. The first night was peaceful. I ate, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually climbed into my tent. The night was colder than I expected. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. At some point, I fell asleep. Something woke me up. A sound outside, a crunch of leaves. My eyes shot open, heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Just the wind, maybe a deer passing through. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold air. My fire had burned down to ash, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. It was unsettling. I shook it off, made coffee on my camp stove, and ate a quick breakfast. I planned to hike up to a ridge I had marked on my map, but something felt off. As I walked around my campsite, I noticed something strange. My firewood pile was disturbed, branches scattered, not just knocked over. Some pieces were missing. I frowned, scanning the ground for tracks, but saw nothing clear. Maybe an animal? A raccoon, maybe. I let it go and packed up for my hike. The trail was overgrown and rough, winding through dense trees and thick underbrush. The higher I climbed, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't exhaustion, it was something else, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I was alone. I kept moving, trying to shake the feeling. At the top, I found a small clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. I took a deep breath, trying to enjoy the moment, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat heavy in my chest, making my skin prickle. I decided to head back earlier than planned. As I made my way down, I noticed something strange. The undergrowth had been disturbed, like something had moved through here recently. But it wasn't a game trail. The branches were snapped high up, as if something tall had passed through. My pulse quickened. I picked up my pace. Back at camp, I felt relief for a moment until I saw my tent. The flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut. My gear was inside, untouched, but something had been in there. My sleeping bag was unrolled. My pack shifted. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the woods. I told myself it had to be an animal, even though nothing was missing. I sat by my fire pit, trying to shake the unease. Night fell, and I forced myself to stay calm. The fire burned bright, casting flickering shadows. But the silence was wrong. The forest should have been alive with sounds. But there was nothing. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made my heart race. At some point, I heard soft, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. Slow, careful, not an animal. My blood ran cold. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped, and the night stretched on in heavy silence. I didn't move, didn't sleep. To first light, I packed up. Fast. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about taking my time. I shoved my gear into my truck, heart pounding. As I was about to climb in, I noticed something in the dirt near my tent. A footprint. Not a boot. Not an animal. A bare human footprint. Large. Deep. Fresh. I didn't stay to examine it. I jumped into my truck, started the engine, and tore down that forest road, rocks kicking up behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over, hands shaking on the wheel. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand what had happened, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Someone or something had been out there with me, watching, waiting. I was never the type to get spooked easily. I grew up hiking, camping, and spending days at a time in the woods. I loved the feeling of being disconnected from the world, the silence that only the wilderness could offer. But after what happened that night, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. It was late October, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. I picked a remote spot deep in the woods of northern Michigan, a place I had found on an old map but had never been to. It was far from any main roads, and as far as I could tell, no one had camped there in a long time. That was part of the appeal. No crowded campgrounds, no noisy groups. Just me, the trees, and the cold autumn air. The drive out was long and rough. The last stretch of the journey was down an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. My truck bounced over deep ruts and rocks, and I had to maneuver carefully to avoid getting stuck. Eventually, I reached a clearing that looked good enough to set up camp. There was a small, stagnant pond nearby, ringed by tall reeds, and beyond that, dense trees stretching endlessly in every direction. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. I pitched my tent close to the truck, built a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun started to dip below the trees, I cooked a simple meal over the fire and let the quiet of the forest settle around me. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was around midnight when things started feeling off. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was sitting in my camp chair, wrapped in a thick flannel, staring into the darkness. I wasn't scared, just aware. The way the trees stood still, the way the air felt heavier. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it does when you're alone in the woods. But then I heard it, a crunch. Not the kind made by a falling branch or a small animal. It was deliberate, slow, steady. Someone, something, was walking in the woods just beyond the light of my fire. I held my breath and listened. Crunch, paused, crunch, stopped, as if it knew I was listening. My hand instinctively went to my belt, where my hunting knife was sheathed. I wasn't a paranoid guy, but I wasn't stupid either. The woods were vast, but I knew for a fact I was the only person out here. At least I thought I was. Minutes passed. The fire crackled softly, but the footsteps didn't return. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon and forced myself to relax. Still, I kept my knife close when I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. No reason, no noise, Just that feeling, you know, the one when something isn't right. The air inside the tent was cold, too cold. My breath came out in pale wisps, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like my body was telling me to stay still. Then I heard it, not footsteps this time, breathing, just outside my tent. Deep, slow breaths. I stayed completely still. I didn't even blink. The breathing was close, too close. I could hear the slight wheeze in it, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to breathe quietly but couldn't. I gripped my knife tight, my fingers trembling. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I waited, listening, straining to hear anything beyond the rapid pounding of my heart. But there was nothing. No footsteps retreating, no rustling leaves, just empty, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed curled in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally started creeping through the fabric of my tent, I forced myself to move. I unzipped the flaps slowly, peeking out. Nothing looked disturbed. The fire pit was the same. My truck, my gear, everything was as I left it. But the ground around my tent had been disturbed. Footprints, not boots, not bare feet, something else. They were long, narrow, almost human but not quite right. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and they circled my tent. I packed up fast, threw everything into the truck without caring how. I didn't eat, didn't even put the fire out properly. I just got in and left. The drive back felt even longer. The whole time, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something in the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless road, the silent woods, and the feeling that I had left something behind. Or worse, that something had followed me. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. Not after that night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend in the woods, just me and the quiet. I'd planned it for weeks. Picked a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual crowded campgrounds. I wanted isolation, peace, time to clear my head. I got something else entirely. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still hanging high in the sky, filtering through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and hiked in. No trails, no signs, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I walked for maybe an hour before settling on a clearing near a small stream. It was perfect. I set up camp methodically, tent first, then gathering firewood. I was no stranger to the outdoors. I'd done this before. The fire crackled as the sun dipped lower. The woods settled into that eerie kind of quiet, where every little sound stands out. The rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs. Normal stuff, at least at first. It wasn't until later that I noticed it. I had just finished eating and was leaning back against a log, watching the fire dance, when I heard something in the distance. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but not quite. It wasn't close, not yet, but it was there. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. I exhaled, shook it off as my mind playing tricks. The woods have a way of doing that. I stoked the fire, making sure it was strong. The darkness beyond it felt heavy, like it was pressing in. I checked my surroundings with my flashlight. Just trees, just the normal shapes of the woods at night. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I heard it again. Closer. It was slow, deliberate. A shuffling sound, but not like an animal. It had weight. I grabbed my knife and stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. My heart was pounding. I wasn't scared, at least I told myself I wasn't. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. I dealt with wildlife before, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The sound stopped again. The woods went silent. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I forced myself to sit back down. I kept the knife close. Every muscle in my body was tense. The fire burned low, and I had to make a choice. Stay up all night or try to sleep. I knew I needed rest, but the idea of closing my eyes felt wrong. Vulnerable. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening. Every little noise made my pulse spike. I gripped my knife under my sleeping bag and waited for sleep to take me. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see outside through the thin fabric of my tent. And then I saw it, a shadow. It was standing just beyond the fire's glow, tall still, watching. My breath hitched. My body went rigid. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of something human. But it wasn't moving. It just stood there. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen. Seconds? Minutes? My mind raced. If I unzipped the tent, would it rush me? If I stayed still, would it go away? I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on it. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. It didn't walk away. It just melted into the trees. I listened for footsteps, for anything. Silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife until my hand ached. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined it standing there again, closer, inside the tent. Dawn took forever to come. When it did, I unzipped the tent carefully, knife in hand, and stepped outside. The forest looked normal, peaceful even. But when I walked around my campsite, I found them. Footprints. Not boots, not animal tracks. Bare human feet pressed deep into the dirt. They circled my camp. They stopped just outside my tent. I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't linger. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. I hiked back to my truck without stopping, barely looking over my shoulder. The whole time I felt watched, like something was just behind me, just out of sight. When I reached my truck, I tossed my pack in and got inside, locking the doors before I even caught my breath. My hands were shaking. I drove until I hit a gas station miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. Only then did I feel safe. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never camp alone again. I always loved camping. It was a way to escape from everything. Work, my phone, the constant hum of traffic. Being alone in the woods with nothing but the sounds of nature made me feel at peace. So when I had the chance to take a long weekend off, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the forests of northern Michigan. The place I chose was remote, far from the popular campgrounds. I didn't want to deal with noisy families or groups of rowdy teenagers. I wanted silence, solitude. I found a small clearing near a river, the kind of spot that felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. It was perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my truck on an old logging road about a quarter-mile from the site, and hiked in with my gear. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above, creating shifting patches of gold on the forest floor. The sound of the river nearby was a steady, calming presence. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got to work making a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped. I sat on a log by the fire, eating a simple meal of jerky and a granola bar, letting the quiet settle in around me. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I had been lying in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. There was the usual chorus of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Total silence. I don't mean it got quieter. I mean every single sound just vanished at once. No wind, no bugs, no movement. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, like the world had been put on mute. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that this wasn't normal. Silence like that usually meant a predator was nearby. A bear, maybe, or a cougar. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting weak, flickering light. Beyond that, the woods were pitch black. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see the glint of eyes reflecting in the darkness, but there was nothing. Still, the feeling didn't go away. That awful, unnatural silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for something to break it. Then, just as suddenly as it stopped, the night sounds returned. Cricket chirped, leaves rustled, the river bubbled on as if nothing had happened. I let out a slow breath and shook my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound made my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Sometime later, I woke up to a faint noise outside, a slow, steady crunching, like footsteps moving through the dry leaves. I froze, my mind instantly alert. It wasn't an animal. Animals move in quick, erratic bursts. These were careful, deliberate steps. Someone was out there. My truck was a good 15-minute walk away. I was alone. No one knew exactly where I had camped. The realization sent a cold wave of fear through me. I grabbed the knife I always kept in my tent and gripped it tightly. The footsteps continued, slow and measured. They circled my campsite, just beyond the dying fire's light. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. For what felt like hours, I sat there, knife in hand, waiting. Then, finally, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were moving away. Slow, deliberate, fading into the distance. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, everything looked normal. My gear was untouched. There were no signs of anything unusual, but I knew what I had heard. I checked the ground around my campsite, searching for footprints. The dry leaves made it hard to see anything distinct, but about 20 feet away, I found something. A single boot print. Fresh, not mine. I packed up my things and left. I didn't run, didn't panic, but I didn't waste any time either. The entire hike back to my truck, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But I never saw a thing. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced at my side mirror. For just a split second, I thought I saw someone, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. But when I looked back, there was nothing there, just the empty woods. I never went camping alone again.